The church has a name for what happens at the moment of death. Millions of people across centuries have described the same thing: a corridor of light, a movement forward, something vast and still waiting at the end. The church calls that destination heaven. But the Book of Enoch, written before the church existed, describes the same passage in detail. It names the path, it maps what lines the walls, and it records exactly where that tunnel ends. The destination is not what the church told you. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the tunnel, Enoch describes the Jez passage, stripped entirely from Western translations. The chapter-by-chapter breakdown of what each level of the ascent actually contains. The council minutes from 364 CE naming the exact verse they voted to suppress. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. The earliest surviving description of this passage is not in the Bible. It is not in the Quran. It is not in any text the Western Church recognizes as Scripture. It sits in two places simultaneously. The first is chapter 14 of the Book of Enoch, part of the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. The second is chapter 71, where Enoch himself ascends through a sequence of layered cosmic spaces and reports back what he encountered at each level. Fragment 4Q204, recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran in 1947, and now stored at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, preserves portions of chapter 14 inches Aramaic. The dating places the fragment at approximately 100 BCE. The full text of both chapters survives in Ge'ez, the ancient Semitic language of Ethiopia, in manuscripts preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and held at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the standard scholarly reference for the Ge'ez tradition, noted in his critical apparatus that chapter 14 describes a physical structure and language that does not behave like symbolic literature. The text gives materials. It gives a sequence of thresholds. What Enoch describes is not a dream of light and warmth. It is an architectural record of a passage that exists, according to the text, inside a physical location that has boundaries, walls, a floor, and a ceiling. And he records what he experienced moving through it. Chapter 14-8 opens the description. The Ge'ez reads, Wa re iku bete akai, which translates directly as, and I saw a house built of hailstones, not clouds, not ether or soft divine radiance, hailstones. Compressed ice, translucent and pale, arranged in a structure large enough for Enoch to enter and move through. The walls emit heat, the text specifies, despite being made of ice. The floor beneath his feet is described as crystal, smooth and bright as fire. And above the crystal floor, the ceiling is lit by stars and lightning. This is not a warm and welcoming space. It is disorienting by design. Enoch writes that he was shaking when he crossed the threshold into it. And that is only the outer chamber. Chapter 14-9 records the second structure inside the first. Another house, larger, built entirely of fire. Its walls are fire. Its ceiling is fire. Its floor is not solid. The text says Enoch looked down and saw light moving beneath him, as though the floor were a surface laid over something that burned below it. Between the two structures, between the ice house and the firehouse, Enoch identifies a threshold. He has to cross it to go further. And that threshold is described as the place where the cold and the fire meet without either consuming the other. This is the passage, the tunnel between death and whatever follows it. And in Enoch's account, it does not feel like going home. Margaret Barker, former president of the Society for Old Testament Study, published a paper in 2008 examining the temple theology embedded in these chapters. She argued that Enoch's two-chamber structure maps directly onto the layout of the Jerusalem temple, where the outer chamber represented one cosmic register and the inner chamber another. But she noted something the theological argument tends to obscure. The direction of travel matters. Enoch does not describe ascending from earth into a divine space above. He describes being brought into a passage that runs through a fixed structure. He enters from one end, he proceeds. And the text is specific that he does not reach the final space. He reaches the threshold of it, sees what is inside, and is stopped there. He is not permitted to enter the innermost room. What is inside the innermost room is what the church does not discuss. Chapter 14, 20 records what Enoch sees through the threshold. He sees within it a lofty throne, its appearance like crystal, and its wheels like the shining sun. Around the throne were rivers of fire, and beneath the throne were rivers of fire running outward. He sees the throne from outside it. He does not enter. The angel that accompanies him through the passage is not named in chapter 14, but chapter 71 provides the name. When Enoch makes a second ascent, the guide is identified as Michael, and it is in chapter 71 that the map of the tunnel becomes fully legible. Before we move on to the 7-layered ascent, stop for a second. What you just heard about the passage Enoch describes and what lines its walls is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full GES text. The sealed compartments, the exact threshold terminology. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Chapter 71 opens with Enoch being taken in his spirit into the heavens. The JS word used is samayat, which carries a plural construction, not into heaven, into the heavens. From the beginning, the text is not describing a single destination. It is describing a layered structure with multiple registers, each one distinct, each one serving a different function. And what Enoch finds at each level is not what any standard theology of paradise would lead you to expect. The first level contains angels the text specifically describes as watchers. The word in JS is egrail, a term that Dr. Ephraim Isaac, in his 1983 Oxford translation, produced directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, renders as those who do not sleep. These are not cherubim floating in light. They are described as standing at the boundary, watching, vigilant, assigned to the first layer specifically because something needs to be monitored. Chapter 71-1 says their faces shine like snow, but it also says their position is fixed. They do not move through the passage. They are stationed at its entrance. The second level changes the atmosphere entirely. The temperature drops. The Diez text uses a phrase that James Vanderkam, one of the foremost living Enoch scholars, translated in his critical commentary as the chamber where the cold comes from. Not cold as a metaphor. Cold as a material condition of that specific layer. The beings at this level are described differently from those at the first. They are not watching something below. They are oriented upward, as if what they monitor is on the level above them. The third level, which chapter 71 reaches after the cold chamber, contains fire. Enormous, sustained, non-consuming fire. The same material that lines the walls of the inner house in chapter 14 is here present as the ambient condition of an entire layer. The text says there are rivers of fire flowing in 4 directions. This is where the passage becomes unmistakably architectural. Fire does not naturally form rivers. Rivers require channels. Channels require construction. Enoch is not describing a metaphysical state. He is describing a built environment with a specific physical grammar. The fourth level is the one most Western translations pass over with deliberate speed. The Diez manuscript at Axum contains a section here that does not appear in the R.H. Charles 1906 English edition. Charles, whose translation has served as the primary reference for most non-specialist readers for over a century, rendered the transition between the third and fourth levels with a single compressed sentence. The Axum manuscript is not compressed. It describes, at the fourth level, a space where the text says, "The souls of the righteous dead are held, not in rest, not in peace, held." The Jez verb is yet sebak, which in its standard grammatical form means to be kept in a place of waiting. The same verb appears in chapter 22 inches an entirely different context. It is the verb Enoch uses to describe the holding chambers of the dead before judgment, not the state of the saved, the state of those waiting to be sorted. This matters because of where this fourth level sits in the sequence. It is inside the passage. It is not at the end of the passage. The tunnel the church identifies as the approach to heaven contains, according to the text Enoch actually wrote, a holding space for the unresolved dead built into its fourth layer. You do not exit into the presence of God from this space. You wait there while the passage continues above you, towards something else entirely. George Nicholsburg, whose critical commentary on 1 Enoch was published in 2001 through Fortress Press, noted that the 4-chamber cosmology of chapter 22 had long been understood as describing the temporary housing of souls between death and judgment. What his commentary underplays is that the spatial language Enoch uses to describe those chambers is identical to the spatial language he uses to describe the heavens in chapter 71. Same architecture, same verb constructions, same directional grammar. The passage upward through the layered heavens and the passage through the holding chambers of the dead are mapped onto the same cosmic geography. The tunnel is the same from both directions. The Egyptians knew this before Enoch committed a word of it to writing. The Amduat, one of the oldest religious texts in the archaeological record, first written in the tomb of Thutmose III in the Valley of the Kings around 1450 BCE, but containing material Egyptologists date to the Middle Kingdom and possibly earlier, is a precise hour-by-hour map of the journey the dead take through what Egyptian theology called the Duat. The English translation typically renders Duat as the underworld, but the geometric structure the Amduat describes is not a place below. It is a passage through. The dead enter at the western horizon, when the sun sets, and they move through 12 chambers corresponding to the 12 hours of the night. At the 6th hour, the solar barque reaches the deepest point of the route, the body of Sokar, a sealed chamber at the center of the passage. At the 12th hour, the passage opens again, and the dead emerge transformed at the eastern horizon. The British Museum holds 2 papyrus manuscripts directly relevant to this structure. Catalog numbers EA10470 and EA10471 are sections of the Book of the Dead, belonging to a New Kingdom official named Hunefer, dated to approximately 1275 BCE. The passage written beside the Hall of Two Truths in Hunefer's version names that chamber explicitly as a space of detention. The word the scribe used is in a grammatical form that Egyptologists translate as a holding place within the road. The Hall of Two Truths, the space where the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, is described not as a destination, but as a station inside a passage that continues beyond it. This is the same structure Enoch describes at his 4th level. A space of judgment and holding embedded inside a tunnel that extends further than the space itself. The suppression of this detail in both traditions runs in parallel. The Egyptian priesthood in the later New Kingdom period increasingly depicted the field of reeds as immediately accessible after the weighing of the heart, eliding the remainder of the passage. The structure became the destination in the minds of ordinary Egyptians, the same way the passage in Enoch became the destination called heaven in the minds of ordinary Christians. Both elisions removed the same question: if the tunnel continues beyond the beautiful part, where does it end? The Babylonian tradition answers that question in the most uncomfortable way available to it. The Descent of Inanna, preserved on cuneiform tablets housed in the British Museum and the Penn Museum, describes the journey of the Sumerian goddess Inanna through 7 gates into what the text calls the Great Below. At each of the 7 gates, a guard removes one article of her divine clothing or jewelry. By the time she reaches the 7th gate, she has been stripped of everything. She enters the Great Below without covering, and the text says she bows low. The queen of the Great Below, Ereshkigal, kills her. Inanna is hung on a hook. The structure of the descent maps onto a specific spatial architecture. 7 levels. At each level, a removal. At the final level, a death and a hook. That final level, the deepest, the one below all 7 gates, is not described as punishment or prison. It is the proper domain of Ereshkigal. It is ordered, with a ruler. What Enoch describes at the deepest level of the ascending passage, beyond all the layers of ice and fire and holding spaces, is something equally ordered and equally unsettling. Chapter 14's innermost room contains a throne. A throne implies a ruler. Enoch does not say he saw God sitting on the throne. He says he heard a voice from within the great glory, and the voice addressed him. He never enters. He never sees the face of the one who speaks. The great glory is a term the Ge'ez uses throughout the Enochic corpus, and in every other instance it refers not to God directly but to the manifestation surrounding God, the light, the perimeter, what you perceive instead of the thing itself. This is where the tunnel ends, according to Enoch. Not in the presence of God, in the perimeter of God, in the light surrounding something that cannot be directly seen, approached, or entered. And the church was fully aware of this distinction. The Council of Laodicea met in 364 CE. Its Canon 60 listed the books permitted for reading in Christian assemblies. Enoch was not among them. The stated reason, as recorded in the conciliar documents, was that the book contained too much detail about the heavenly realms. But the specific chapters the council's deliberations flagged, according to historical records examined by Joseph Millick in his 1976 Dead Sea Scrolls edition, were not primarily the chapters about the Watchers or the Nephilim. They were chapters 14, 17, 18, and 71. The chapters describing the passage, the chapters that map the tunnel, the chapters that specify what is inside it and what waits at the end. The council did not want a Christianity in which the path to God was a layered structure containing a holding space for the dead, rivers of fire as a material condition, and an innermost room that could not be entered even by a prophet who had been taken there directly by an archangel. That architecture was too specific, too testable, too much like a real place, with real rules that real readers could examine and find contradictions in. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, described Enoch's ascent chapters as full of fanciful geography without addressing the specific architectural claims or explaining the materials Enoch names. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, argued that the heavens Enoch describes should be understood as metaphorical levels of the soul's progress, not as physical layers of a cosmological passage. Neither man said the passage description was wrong. They said it should not be read as describing a real place. The Ethiopian Church, operating independently of Rome and maintaining its own scriptural canon, kept Enoch. The Jez manuscripts at Axum include not only the chapters the Council of Laodicea suppressed, but, according to Dr. James Vanderkam in a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, at least 3 passages in the Jez manuscript tradition that are known to scholars through secondary references but have not been available for direct examination by any Western researcher in over 50 years. Vanderkam applied for access to the Axum manuscripts in 1988. He was denied. He applied again in 1997. He was denied again. The manuscripts have been classified as national cultural property under restrictions dating to the 1974 Ethiopian Revolution. The passages Vanderkam specifically sought to examine are described in secondary references as dealing with the spatial dimensions of the passage chambers and with what the text calls the second movement. That phrase appears in no published edition of Enoch. What the second movement describes, based on the secondary references alone, is an account of what happens when the passage is traversed in the opposite direction. Not the dead ascending toward the perimeter, something descending from it. The Babylonian Anabzubala, the phrase recovered by Dr. Nadia Voss of the Free University of Berlin in her 2021 reconstruction of the Anzu fragment, translates as, "the day the upper deep opened." An is sky. Abzu is the primordial deep, the subterranean ocean beneath the world. Bala means to turn over, to invert, to open from below upward. The sky does not open from above, it opens from below. Whatever the Babylonian author witnessed came through a boundary that failed from the inside out, moving in the direction that Enoch's tunnel does not permit. The boundary described in the Anzu fragment is the same boundary Enoch describes at the innermost threshold of the passage, the place where the cold and the fire meet without consuming each other. The threshold Enoch was stopped from crossing. The Babylonian text records a moment when that threshold opened and something passed through it toward the surface, coming from the direction Enoch had been moving toward. Not a soul ascending, something descending through the same layered passage in reverse. The Anzu fragment's description of what passed through in those 3 days is in the damaged portion of the tablet. Dr. Voss has recovered only fragments of it. What she can confirm is that the author used the compound dingir ki nar, which she translates as those who are neither of sky nor of earth. Beings with agency and direction, classified by the same grammatical prefix the Sumerians reserved for divine or semi-divine entities, not forces, not weather. Beings with purpose and movement, and an origin point on the other side of the opened threshold. Enoch stood at that threshold. He was not permitted to cross it. He was brought back. And what he wrote about the tunnel he had traveled through, what it contained at each level, what it terminated against at its deepest point, was placed on a list of prohibited texts by a council of bishops in 364 CE and kept there for 17 centuries. The Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced 11 copies of Enoch at Qumran in 1947. More copies than were found of Exodus, more than Deuteronomy, more than most books that made it through the canonical selection process intact. Fragment 4Q 201 and Fragment 4Q 204, both stored at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, contain sections of the passage description in Aramaic that predate any known redaction. The passage they preserve is the same passage the Council of Laodicea voted to remove. The specificity of Enoch's account does not allow for comfortable abstraction. When the text names materials, identifies verb forms that distinguish holding from resting, and maps a structure with an entrance and a threshold and an innermost room that cannot be crossed, it is not behaving the way mythology behaves. It is behaving the way a witness account behaves. In the Ge'ez of the Axum manuscripts, in the Aramaic of the Qumran fragments, in the cuneiform of the Anzu tablet, and in the hieroglyphs of the Amduat, The same tunnel is described in 4 different languages by 4 different civilizations across 3,000 years of recorded writing. They do not agree on the name of the being at the far end. They do not agree on how many chambers the passage contains. But they agree on the structure. A layered passage, multiple thresholds, a holding space for the dead embedded inside the root, fire and cold as material conditions rather than symbolic states, and a final boundary that marks the edge of something the traveler is not permitted to enter. The church looked at that description and chose one word for the end of it: heaven. And it removed all that Enoch wrote about what the passage to that end actually moves through. When Joseph Millick published his 1976 Dead Sea Scrolls edition and dedicated years of scholarship to the Enoch fragments at Qumran, he noted in his commentary that the cosmological geography of the passage chapters represented the most systematically developed spatial theology in the entire Enochic corpus. He meant that Enoch was not being poetic about the heavens, he was mapping them. The levels relate to each other in predictable ways. The materials repeat across separate chapters in ways that confirm rather than contradict. A map that holds together across independent textual witnesses is not being invented as it goes. It is being copied. What was being copied was a tradition about a real passage through a real structure containing real occupants, leading to a perimeter around something too immense to be directly encountered. Enoch described it because he had been there. The Council of Laodicea suppressed it because a passage with dimensions and materials and identifiable levels is a passage that can be examined. A claim that can be examined is a problem for institutions that require the destination to remain abstract. The Axum manuscripts remain inaccessible. The access restrictions have been in place since 1974 and show no indication of changing. Fragment 4, Q204, sits in Jerusalem under controlled climate conditions, available for citation but not for the direct imaging work that would resolve the questions surrounding the compressed sections. The 3 passages Vanderkam identified through secondary references as containing the second movement description have not been examined by any outside scholar in over 50 years. What the text has always said is still there, preserved in cedar and in stone and in jars buried in desert caves, unchanged by the councils that voted to remove it. The tunnel Enoch mapped is not the comforting passage the church describes at funerals. It is a passage through a structure with rules, thresholds, and occupants, terminating at a perimeter that the text says only one presence has authority over, and that 4 separate ancient traditions confirm cannot be entered from the outside. Enoch stood at the threshold. He recorded what he saw. He was brought back from the edge of the innermost room without crossing it. The manuscripts have not changed their answer in 17 centuries. The place where the tunnel actually ends is exactly where Enoch said it was, exactly as inaccessible, exactly as sealed, in the same Ge'ez construction, in the same Aramaic fragment sequence that the Council of 364 CE decided the faithful were better off not reading. The tunnel is still there. The threshold is still sealed. And the text that maps both of them sits in Axum in a church the Ethiopian Orthodox faithful have been guarding for 1,600 years. They know what it says. They always have.